Hi everyone, welcome again to Miss Mokwa's AICE Psychology audio lectures. Hope you're all having a wonderful day. Students, this is going to be study number 2 in the cognitive unit by Baron-Cohen. So go ahead and take out some notes if you have them. Remember, if you'd like to turn in your PowerPoint questions early for extra credit, that's an opportunity that you will have throughout the entire year. So please remember, if you'd like to turn in these PowerPoint questions, the homework at the end of the presentation in for extra credit, please do so one full day before they're due. So of course, if they're due on a Tuesday, you can give them to me on a Monday, and feel free to do that whenever you'd like to earn some extra credit for the course. Also, as I've said previously, remember that these presentations are available through YouTube, and you can ask any questions you'd like as long as you record them on your notes. You can use this with the matching PowerPoint from class, whatever works best for you. And with that, guys, we're going to get started. Okay, everyone, so the topic we're going to be addressing today in Baron-Cohen is the idea of empathy and theory of mind. Now, empathy is how we relate to others on an emotional level. Empathy is a general concept. Theory of mind is a more specific version of that concept, so we'll be getting into that in just a moment. Baron-Cohen wants to investigate how people with different abilities, in this case it's going to be two different populations, people with Asperger's syndrome, and for the purpose of the presentation we're going to call that AS, and people with high-functioning autism, or HFA, how they recognize emotions in others. Even though it might seem like an innately human quality, different populations have different strengths and weaknesses. It's important that we recognize these two different populations in a positive manner. Make sure there's no stigma attached to saying that someone has Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism. These may be disorders, but they are not diseases. So we need to view the people in these populations as humanly as possible. Remember that they have tons of interesting and important capabilities. It's not that they can't do certain things, it's that they have strengths and weaknesses that might be different than someone who's what we call neurotypical, which just means, in a basic way, normal. So we're going to take a look at these two populations today, see how they process emotions, see how they feel empathy, and how this concept of theory of mind is going to be tested. Moving on to some background, let's talk about a little bit more about these two different populations. Now, the first one we have is AS, that is Asperger's syndrome. Asperger's syndrome and HFA, high-functioning autism, are not the same. So let's make sure we write down somewhere, take a note. We need to fully comprehend and understand that these two populations are different. They have fundamental similarities, but there are enough differences that we can call them two different things. So let's think about it in this way. Individuals with AS, Asperger's syndrome, they have a very specific problem, and their problem is more with social interaction. They have trouble understanding nonverbal communication. So what do I mean when I say nonverbal communication? Well, I mean things like social cues. Understanding how people feel in the social world based on nonverbal communications. So for example, someone gives you a smile, or they give you a thumbs up. They could bow if that's appropriate in their culture. They could, give you a wink. Any kind of nonverbal communication. They could lean in while you're speaking. Maybe they would nod while you talk. All of those cues are things that people with AS struggle with. Somehow they have problems in processing where they see the same things we see. They visually are still seeing the same stimuli, but they don't know how to process it, and they can't put it in the context of different human emotions. So that's the problem with AS. It is a very specific form of autism. So if autism is the overall umbrella, Asperger's syndrome is just like a subtype. So please write down, mark, highlight, or annotate somewhere on the slide that AS and HFA are significantly different. AS is a much more specific diagnosis that has to do with your social understandings of the world, how someone with AS would perceive human relationships and emotions in the social context. Now, if we move on to HFA, or high-functioning autism, this is a more general diagnosis. We have to remember that when we talk about autism, the diagnosis comes on a spectrum. We call it the autism spectrum. it's not that you have the disorder or you don't. It's not a black and white thing like a light switch. It's on or it's off. It's yes or it's no. With autism, we have this spectrum, meaning that people can have all different personal manifestations of the disorder. So I could have autism and have more of the Asperger's side of it, where I have social issues, understanding how people think and feel in a broader context when it comes to human interaction. Or I could have high-functioning autism in a different way, where I may have very directed interests in one topic. I may be nonverbal. There are other types of autism. HFA just means someone has autism, but they function very highly. It's not so much about issues with human interaction or being social. It's a more general diagnosis about that person's abilities and how they function. So just to summarize those two, AS, Asperger's syndrome, much more social and specific. HFA, high-functioning autism, much more general and non-specific. If you'd like to, please take a moment and view those 2 YouTube videos. If not, don't worry, we're going to be viewing those in class. Moving on to background. Now, take a moment to look this one over because it's a bit tricky. Even though, as we discussed, Asperger's and autism, AS and HFA, are in 2 different groups, we are going to group them for this experiment together. People with AS and HFA are going to be in the same experimental group. Now, you might be wondering, Ms. Mokwa, why is this okay? Why is that acceptable? They have differences. Well, that's a fair thing to say. AS and HFA do have their differences, but fundamentally, we are looking at the same type of cognitive processing issue. So because on the underlying deepest level, the issue is about cognitive processing, it is okay that we put these 2 groups together into one group. It is okay to put people who are AS and HFA in the same active experimental group. One good thing about putting both individuals in the same group is that even if someone has AS or HFA, we can compare. So even though they're in the same experimental group, we are still going to be able to compare in the data how they do versus other groups that are neurotypical or normal. So even though they're being kind of clumped together in this case, you'll see as we go through that in the data, the results are still very clear, which is another reason that this kind of grouping is okay. Let's go ahead and talk about empathy. You'll see that on the bottom of the slide. We'll be watching the videos in class, as I've said. Empathy, in short, is feeling with someone else. The ability to put yourself in someone else's emotional shoes and feel what they feel. Allowing yourself to become vulnerable and be in the same emotional space that someone else is occupying. So if you say that someone was empathetic, you would be saying that person is very good at allowing themselves to be vulnerable and feel what that person feels. So if your best friend had just suffered some kind of great loss, if they had lost a parent, for example, if someone you love didn't get the job promotion they were hoping for, or didn't get into the college they were hoping for. Or on the positive note, if someone that you care for just got married or got an amazing new job or something really, really wonderful, the fact that you're empathetic, that you have empathy, means that you feel what they feel on the positive and on the negative. This might seem like something that all humans have, and on some level we do. But when it comes to varying populations, like people with AS and HFA, they may not be able to process the external stimuli. They look at the same things we look at. They see the same things we see. So we see a smile, they see a smile. But we have the ability to know what that smile means. So we know that smile means, I'm happy to see you, or I'm having a great day, or I'm in a wonderful mood right now. Whereas someone with AS or HFA may see the same smile, but they cannot connect the smile to a positive mind state. So they do not know that smile equals happy, or that frown equals sad, or that, tears equal sad. They can see the same things that we see, but they can't process the information on the cognitive level and tie that to an emotional state. So that's what we're looking at when we think about empathy in this study and in this slide. Moving on now to slide 5. You should be on slide 5. This is background. So let's get a little more specific. We just talked about empathy. Now we're going to talk about theory of mind. So I would mark somewhere, write down somewhere, annotate that theory of mind and empathy are different. Empathy is the general concept, and theory of mind is a specific skill based on context and examples. So if we wanted to define theory of mind, we would say that theory of mind is the ability to understand what someone is thinking or feeling in a certain situation and why they would think that way or feel that way. So it's not just understanding what's happening, it's understanding why someone feels the way they do in that situation. So let me give you an example. So let's say I was walking in the hallway one day and I'm passing by one of my students. And my student sees me, we make eye contact, and they give me a really mean look, a really angry, very upset kind of look, and they kind of shove me in the hallway. When they're walking by, they kind of hit me with their shoulder. Now, I can put together with the context clues of the situation and the expression on that person's face, in their eyes, that they might not be too happy with me. Maybe I've upset them in some way. Maybe I said something that upset them. Maybe they're just having a bad day. But I can kind of put two and two together and say, wow, something is going on with Susie, or something is going on with Mark. Why are they acting that way? Why do they act that way in the hallway? Maybe they're having a bad day. So that's an example of theory of mind. You can understand why someone is feeling the way they are in a certain situation, what that might mean. Another funny example that one of my students gave last year was that imagine for a moment that you are in a long-term committed relationship and you're in high school. And all of a sudden, you're in between classes, you turn the corner, and you see your long-term romantic partner kissing somebody else. Now, let's say that they see you, see them. So they see you, see them kind of caught in that position. Now, if your partner had theory of mind, they would understand why in that moment you could be very upset. They would understand why you would feel feelings like anger or sadness or confusion or betrayal. They would know what you're feeling in that moment because they understand the relationship you had and how a boundary was violated. So that's a great example of theory of mind. If you're a more visual person like me and you'd like a visual example, take a moment and look to the right. Now, we have two people in this example. Let's say we have the boy on the left, that's Ethan, and we have the girl in the middle, that's Anna. So if you look at the graphic, what you're seeing is that Ethan is thinking, okay? Anna is thinking about Ethan. What is he thinking? And then Ethan on the very end, all the way to the right, is thinking about what Anna thinks about him. We call this metacognition or social cognition. It's the idea of knowing how someone else thinks of you. So understanding how someone else perceives you. You are thinking about what someone else thinks of you. So for example, if we look at Ethan on the end again, he could be thinking about, does Anna like me? Does she think that I like her? Because of the way we treat each other in class, maybe we smile, maybe we laugh. Does Anna know that I like her? Does she know that I think about her in a positive way? That's an example of theory of mind. Understanding how someone else perceives you and why they would perceive you in that manner. Now, getting into the specifics of the actual study and of the actual test, let's talk about what Baron-Cohen was trying to create and achieve. Baron-Cohen created what we call the AICE test. You are going to learn about two different versions of the AICE test, the original and the revised. Please make a note that for your ACE exam and for our quiz in class, you are going to have to understand the original AICE test, what it was and how it functioned. And the biggest thing about it that we need to know is all of its flaws, all the things about it that weren't ideal. So Baron-Cohen went back a few years later and he improved it. So we have the original AICE test and we have the improved AICE test. Both will be on your quiz and both will be on the ACE exam. So using these two tests, Baron-Cohen is going to investigate how people with Asperger's syndrome, AS, and high-functioning autism, HFA, process emotional information. Baron-Cohen wants to see if these individuals have a theory of mind. Do they have it or do they not? How is he going to do that? Well, he's going to create his own test, and this test is going to be used in a way that he will be able to see if a person who has AS or HFA can understand the emotion behind someone's eyes. Just the eyes, not the whole face. Please make a note and keep that in mind. So it's about just the eyes in this test. It's not called the Baron-Cohen face test. It's the Baron-Cohen eyes test. So if you'd like an example, go ahead and look at the main feature of the slide toward the bottom. I'll give you a moment to do that, and then I'll do a bit of explaining for you. Okay, so taking a look at the eyes test, please make a note that right now, the graphic you are seeing, the example, is from the revised eye test. It is not from the original. It is from the revised version. The original version, as I said, was quite flawed. It only had 2 answer choices, not 4 answer choices. So just to give you a brief overview of what this is going to be like, and you can actually earn some extra credit. We're going to do that in class as well, but if you are listening to this audio lecture and you'd like to get ahead on some extra credit, there are versions of this test that you can take online. So if you would like to take this test online, print out your results and then write me a paragraph about your results and about your experience taking the test. I will happily offer you some extra credit on your next quiz. So in brief, what we're seeing on this test is that the participant is given a sliver of the face, just this section that shows the eyes. We're not going to see the mouth. We're not going to see any other part of the face because that could give away other social cues, and we don't want that. So we are just going to see on this test a picture of the eye area. Now you're going to have the picture, and beneath the picture, the participant will see 4 answer choices on the revised test. You'll see surprised, joking, happy, or sure about something. The person would then choose the answer they believe is correct, and then we would tally the correct answers. So this is a great example. This is from the Baron-Cohen eyes test revised version. So this is a great example of what the test would look like for someone who is really taking it. Okay, moving on to a comparison slide. Now we have the original eyes test that was made in 1997. It was a good place to start from. It's a basic test. Nothing like this had ever been made. So it was a really wonderful innovation, but it had many flaws. So because of those many flaws, Baron-Cohen decided to go back later on and make a revised version of the test. Now, it fixed the vast majority of the issues with the original. It's a lot more valid and reliable than the original. Take a moment and look this over, and please make note of the consider part of the slide. Okay, looking at our purpose or aim, as I said, we'll have one of these in every single PowerPoint and study we go over. In this case, the aim was to test whether a group of adults with AS or HFA would be impaired, now impaired means do poorly on, a newly updated version of the eyes test, the reading the mind in the eyes task. Now you can call it a task or a test, doesn't really matter. We are going to work with a very complex sample here, so just make a note when we get to the sample. It's going to be very multi-layered, so make sure we really pay attention when we get to that point. Okay, IVs and DVs. In this case, the IV, independent variable, is the type of participant in each condition. So the person with AS or HFA, the dependent variable, results or scores on the test. Now, we're going to see results on the Baron-Cohen eyes test and also on a different test called the AQ test. Now, the AQ test is something very different. It's very straightforward, and we're just going to go over that a little bit later. Just understand that the DV encompasses all of the results, not just the results from the eyes test. Participants and sample. As I said, this part gets a little bit tricky, so please make sure to really pay attention. We have one active group. The active group is the people with AS or HFA, Asperger's syndrome, high-functioning autism. That part is pretty straightforward. Now, we also have 3 control or comparison groups. In our last study for Andrade, we only had a total of 2 groups, one active, one baseline or control. In this experiment, we have 3 comparison and control groups and 1 active group. So we have in total 4 different groups being looked at. So let's go over these 4 groups one by one. Of course, we have the active group. Then we have the normal adult group. So we have adults who do not have AS or HFA. We have normal students, so students who do not have AS or HFA. And then we have normal IQ match. So individuals of various ages who have the same IQs on average that those in the AS or HFA groups do. Now, why is this important? Please highlight the normal IQ match group. They are very, very crucial. This is because we need to understand that regardless of any kind of negative energy or stigma people unfortunately put on those who are not neurotypical or not normal, they are not in any way less intelligent. So someone who has Asperger's or autism is in no way less intelligent than someone who does not, looking at that from a numerical score of their IQ. Most people with Asperger's and autism have average IQs. They're right within the curve. You know, when you look at the data, it's usually a nice bell curve. So they're right within that curve. This test needs to be about measuring intelligence when it comes to emotions, emotional intelligence, not your IQ about how many math problems you can do or how good you are at certain kinds of reasoning. This test needs to be about emotional intelligence, emotional understanding, and emotional processing. So with that being the case, we need to make sure that the IQ is matched. The people in the AS-HFA active group and people who are in the normal IQ match group have the same IQ scores. The only difference between them is that, of course, the active group has Asperger's autism and the IQ match group does not. That is crucial because now we are only working with one variable, which is the diagnosis. On the bottom of the slide here, you'll find some basic summaries. The original AICE test, as I've said, was more simple, more flawed, and the revised test was a lot more complex. It really tried to fix a lot of the issues with the original. Now, 2 really great fixes that they came up with for the revised test, and please mark or highlight these, were the expansion of 4 answer choices from 2 answer choices and the use of a glossary. Now, please put a star or an extra mark on the glossary. We are going to talk about that quite a bit in class. Okay, everybody, moving on to method and design. At this point, you guys should be on slide 11. We are currently on slide 11. Once again, we've got a laboratory experiment. What does that mean? Of course, it was done in a lab, highly standardized. Procedures should be very, very stepwise, very logical. Every external variable should be controlled as much as possible, and every participant, every person in the sample should have a very, very similar experience. Once again, we've got an independent groups design. Referencing Andrade from our last study, that just means that once you are placed in a group, you cannot move to another group. If you are in the active group, you're in the active group from the very beginning of the experiment to the very end of the experiment. Now let's take a moment and really dive into this term that you're seeing next to that, quasi-experiment. Now this is going to be on the quiz, that's a little hint. And it's very important to understand the difference between a regular experiment and a quasi-experiment. So let's compare these two a little bit. A regular experiment or a lab experiment, you're going to try to control as many variables as possible to make things as logical and controlled as you can. That makes sense. A quasi-experiment is an experiment where you cannot control every single variable. A quasi-experiment means that people are sorted into experimental groups based on a quality they inherently or organically naturally have. So you cannot sort people in a quasi-experiment. You can't sort them randomly. You can't sort them based on how you would like them to be. You have to sort people in a quasi-experiment based on a quality they already possess. So for example, if I wanted to do an experiment in class about intelligence, how smart someone is, let's say IQ, and I wanted to try to debunk that myth that blondes are not as smart as brunettes, or light-haired people are not as smart as dark-haired people, I would be doing a quasi-experiment because I would be sorting my class, my boys and girls in my class, based on hair color. Their natural, not dyed, nothing from like highlights or anything, from their natural hair color. I would say, okay, here's the test, everyone. I'm going to sort you into 3 groups. Brunettes, please sit on this side of the room. Blondes, please sit in the middle of the room. Redheads on this side, and people with naturally black hair on this side. So I would be sorting people into groups based on a natural quality they have. So that example for this one would be hair color. You could do it based on eye color. You could do it based on height. You could do it based on a bunch of different criteria. But that is a quasi-experiment. It's an experiment where you try to control every variable you can, but there's one variable you can't control. Applying this to Baron-Cohen, we cannot say that someone has AS or HFA if they don't. We can't put a normal person in the AS or HFA group. That would make no sense. You can't put someone in a group in which they don't belong naturally. So that's what we mean when we talk about a quasi-experiment in the context of Baron-Cohen. It was really the only logical way to go about the study because AS and HFA are not characteristics that you can change. Once someone is on the spectrum and they've been identified as someone with those needs, they are on that spectrum. Let's compare and contrast the original AICE test with the improved AICE test. So, original AICE test, participants are separated into 2 groups. We had a control group, a normal group, and the AS-HFA. They were asked to look at photos of the eye area, kind of like the one you just saw a few slides back. Then they were told out of their 2 answer choices, which is the correct emotion that person is feeling based on what their eyes look like. Please choose option 1 or option 2, so happy or sad. The problem with this test also is that they presented opposites. We call those foils. So on the original test, you would have options like happy or sad. Things got a lot more complex as we moved to the revised test. And then lastly, they had their scores assigned based on how many they got right. So how many emotions they correctly identified from the picture. That's how the score would be determined. Now that we've looked at the basic procedure of the original AICE test, let's go a little bit more in depth about its issues. As I've said, it was a forced choice between 2 opposites, happy, sad, sympathetic, unsympathetic. There were too few questions. Please highlight this term ceiling effect. We're going to discuss that in class and a little bit later. So too few questions. There were 25 questions in all. Now, if you have a test that's too easy and you have too few questions, that's how you get the ceiling effect. The ceiling effect is when your test is too easy, too simple, too few questions, and too many participants are getting perfect scores. So if I was to give a quiz in my psych class and, out of 40 students, 30 students got 100, I'd have a problem. I would have the ceiling effect. It shows that the test is too easy because too many people got a perfect score. Also, if too many people get a perfect score, I'm not going to have a fair representation of my data. My data isn't really usable at that point. So that's a huge issue, and that's what the ceiling effect is. Some questions also had emotions that were too simple. Things like happy, sad. They were not complex enough to represent what it's really like to have an emotional experience. So a complex emotion would be something like feeling guilt, or a complex emotion could be something like joy. Those have undertones of having more going on beneath the surface than just happy or sad. You could say that anxious is complex, forlorn is complex. Those are emotions that carry a certain kind of weight. It's not just a black and white happy or sad. So that was also another issue on the test. Now, because this test is a visual test and the eyes need to look straight center to get a good shot of the person, a good picture of the person, if the person was looking in a certain direction, like too far to the left or too far to the right, it would look like the person who took the picture, who's in the picture, was ignoring the cameraman. that could be a huge problem. So we don't want the way the photo was taken to influence the emotion that's being conveyed. The person is supposed to look straight on ahead and then portray the emotion through the eyes, but not based on, for example, their head tilt position or something like that. Now, we have a skew here as well. We have a lack of balance between male and female faces in the photos. We should have an even amount. So if we had 40 questions, we should have 20 questions with a female face and 20 questions with a male face, 20 questions with female eyes and 20 questions with male eyes. So that lack of balance in male and female faces is a problem. It's not symmetrical and it's not representative of the population and of how we would socially interact with people. By the way, guys, if you hear a meow, that's my cat, so just sorry about that. It's hard to record an audio lecture when you've got 3 cats, so just give me 1 second here. Okay, guys, we're going to continue, but if you hear a purr or if you hear a meow, that's just because I have the cat under my chair. So if you hear any purring noises or the little sounds of their feet, just don't worry, we'll move right on along. If we look at that last point, having trouble understanding certain words, that is a very important point that I'd like for you to mark, highlight, or annotate. Now, a big issue with this original test is that not everyone has the same vocabulary knowledge. It doesn't matter if you have Asperger's or autism, if you're a quote-unquote normal person. All of us have different vocabularies and read different things, from the morning newspaper to very heavy and intense textbooks. So because everyone has a different vocabulary, we needed to fix that. If I didn't understand one of the words and I got the question wrong simply because of a lack of vocabulary knowledge, that really undermines the validity of my test. I've now got another variable that is coming in that could really affect how someone does. Their final result could be flawed. It's going to be incomplete because maybe they got answers wrong simply because they've never heard the word forlorn or never seen the word anxious written in print before. So because of that, we really need to address that issue of vocabulary right away. Please take a moment and look over some of the improvements to the AICE test, and then we'll continue. All right, so moving on. Improvements. We now have 36 questions. The photographs were evenly split for gender, so we have 18 photos of female eyes and 18 photos of male eyes. This is much better. We no longer have that gender issue. We have 4 answer choices instead of 2, so we don't have a forced opposite choice. We don't have foils, like happy or sad. We have 4 answer choices, and they are considerably more complex. Now please highlight, mark, or annotate where it says added sex recognition task. That is a separate test. That is going to be a separate test that we're going to talk about later on, but it is very important for your quiz and for the AICE exam. So please understand that at this point in the PowerPoint, the sex recognition test is a completely separate test to the AICE test. It's just going to be used to help complement it and get some additional data. And then, of course, as I've said, we've addressed one of our biggest issues was this glossary. We added a glossary, Baron-Cohen added a glossary in the second version of his test so that anyone who doesn't understand a word can look in the glossary, understand the word, and then give an answer based on the emotion being conveyed in the eyes, not just some lack of vocabulary knowledge. Okay? Now please go ahead and also mark AQ test. The AQ test is another separate test, not part of the Baron-Cohen AICE test, that is just going to help complement the results. It's going to help give some more context about how people with autism and Asperger's are assigned to different parts of that spectrum. Okay, so looking into these improvements a little bit more, we've already discussed the vast majority of these, but here is where we're going to talk about the sex recognition test. You can call it the sex recognition test or the sex recognition task. So task or test doesn't really matter. This is a separate test that is going to help really clarify some of Baron-Cohen's findings. So this test was given only to the people in the active group. This is a test only given to those in the active group who have AS or HFA. Why is that? Well, we want to make sure that people with AS and HFA see the same physical world that we do. So it's not something based on their vision. So, for example, if I was, as I am now, sitting at my dining room table making this lecture and I have a cup of tea in front of me, I have a green cup right now, actually, in front of me filled with tea. Can someone who has AS or HFA see the same green cup that I see? Do they physically see the same world that we do? So how is Baron-Cohen going to test that? Well, they are going to look at the test that they just took, and they are going to ask the people in the active group, okay, so you saw 18 sets of eyes that were one gender, and you saw 18 sets of eyes that were another gender. So they know it's evenly split. But they're going to say, okay, sir, if I pull up this picture and imagine it was the slide that you saw previously, the example of the Baron-Cohen AICE test that had the female, okay? The goal of the test is to figure out, can people with AS or HFA understand the gender of each pair of eyes? So can they tell, for example, those are a woman's eyes or those are male eyes? Can they put together that, for example, female eyes usually have longer eyelashes. Female eyes usually have thinner eyebrows that are a little bit more arched. Female eyes tend to have a bit of a lighter lid and not so heavy underneath. Whereas male eyes tend to have shorter eyelashes, things like that. They tend to have a different physical makeup. So they want to give this sex recognition task to see if people with AS and HFA can physically identify the eyes. Are they male eyes or are they female eyes? So we found with this test that people with AS and HFA can, of course, visually see the biological differences between male and female that really kind of give you hints as to the gender of the person in the picture based on this eye area. They too notice these differences about male and female eyes, about, for example, the shape of the eyes or the length of the eyelashes. So they physically see the same things that we do. Moving on to our results, we should be on slide 17. So Baron-Cohen was correct. As predicted, people who have AS or HFA, the individuals in the active group, do significantly worse on identifying these emotions in the AICE test. In the revised eye test, they do the worst out of all of the groups. So let's take a moment and look at our data. Okay, so on the revised eye test, if you were in the AS or HFA group, if you have Asperger's or autism, you had the worst score. Okay? This makes sense. These results are what Baron-Cohen was anticipating and expecting. The other groups do significantly better and stay within a pretty tight range. The adult controls, student controls, and IQ match controls. Now, interestingly, the IQ match controls do the best. They get an average score of about 31 or 30.9 if you don't want to round. This really does make a great deal of sense that IQ is not really what's being tested here. It's emotional connection and empathy that's being tested here. So how intelligent you are isn't what it's about. It's really about your ability to empathetically understand emotions being conveyed in a nonverbal way. Now, something else I'd like to mention, if you could add this to your notes, please. On the sex recognition test and on the main test, the revised eye test, females do better. Okay? It is a slight bit in the data. It's not a huge difference. Women don't do significantly better than men, but we find it interesting. It's enough that we would want to note it. So we are going to talk about in class, when we discuss the nature-nurture aspects of this experiment, why is it that females on the sex recognition test and on the revised test, why they do better in general. Now, the last test we're going to talk about is the AQ test. This is called the Autism Quotient Test. So AQ stands for Autism Quotient. This is a test that measures how many autistic traits someone has. So I would visually think of it this way. An arrow upward, meaning more traits that are autistic, means arrow downward, worse score on this test. So you would expect someone to have a very high AQ score they would do very poorly on the AICE test. So the higher the AQ score, the lower the score we would believe on the Baron-Cohen revised eye test, because the more autistic traits someone has, the worse they are going to do at this concept of understanding the emotion someone feels and processing this empathy and processing this theory of mind. They really have a deficit in that skill. So if we look down at the AQ test results or test scores, these make a ton of sense. The AS or HFA group, of course, because of their diagnosis and where they are on the spectrum, they are going to have many more autistic traits than someone in the normal groups. Now, 18.3 and 18.9, those are very, very average scores. Those are correct scores. So anyone who is quote-unquote normal would fall in this 18 to 20 range. Someone who has AS or HFA, it makes perfect sense that they would fall at about 34 to 35 on the AQ test. So moving on to our conclusions, the revised eye test really did confirm Baron-Cohen's hypothesis and aim. There is a significant deficit in cognitive processing, especially when we look at things like theory of mind and empathy. So if someone is on the spectrum, if they have AS or HFA, they fail to identify the emotions of others as well as normal individuals. They cannot understand these unspoken social cues. They cannot understand as well emotion conveyed by the eyes. Okay? There is a significant theory of mind deficit linked to those with AS or HFA. I will give you a hint that that will be on your quiz. Okay? As I hinted at earlier, females do better in general, whether they have AS or HFA, whether they're normal adults, normal students, normal IQ match. Women tend to do better. It's not a landslide difference. It's not an incredible difference, but it's significant in the fact that it's quite noticeable. So we are going to discuss in class and have an extra credit opportunity discussing nature versus nurture and why we believe females in general do better on these tests of emotion. Okay, back to our good old strengths and weaknesses. Of course, beginning with the strengths, we've already discussed what it means to have a lab experiment. So I'm going to move right past that real quick. Take a moment to look it over if you'd like to. Moving on to weaknesses, we discussed in depth what it means that this was a quasi-experiment. That significantly lowers the validity of the experiment just because you cannot randomly assign your participants, you cannot control which group they enter. That could give you some confounding variables. There has to be a barrier of entry. How do you determine what if someone's on the fence? What if someone is borderline AS or HFA and you're not sure which group to put them in? That could cause some problems for you in a quasi-experiment. For example, if you remember the example I gave a little bit earlier when I talked about quasi-experiments and hair color, well, what if someone's hair isn't quite blonde, but it isn't quite brown? Or what if someone's hair isn't quite red and it isn't quite blonde? So there are some weaknesses to the quasi-experiment when you have to determine who belongs in each group and how you're going to structure that criteria. Now, we also had a small sample size. This is not good. It's hard to generalize. We have a very large population, and when we have a small sample, it means that we are not getting as diverse a group as we would like. So even though it was a decent size, it really doesn't do the job because the rates of Asperger's and autism are increasing. So we need significant numbers of people for a meaningful statistical analysis. If you have read or if you have heard that the rates of Asperger's and autism are increasing, that is true. Generationally speaking, we have far more people with those two diagnoses now than we did 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So because the diagnosis is fairly common, we need to have a large sample. If we were working with a very, very rare population, so for example, if we were working with artistic savants, or if we were working with a population that it's incredibly hard to find, it's okay to have a smaller sample because you can have a sample of 10 if the worldwide population of that group is 100. So if it's very rare and you get 10 people, you're lucky. But if you have a large sample to draw from. If the rates of autism and Asperger's are increasing as they are, you should have a larger sample to accommodate all that growth and all those changes. Looking into ethics, this is a very ethically strong experiment. It has very few weaknesses because the study was explained thoroughly. Consent was obtained. So we've talked about consent before. That means that a consent form was signed. Everyone in the experiment knew what was going to happen to them in a general way. They knew how they would be compensated. They knew how what they would be going through that day. So there was a really positive element with the consent there. There was no deception that needed to be used. So if there's no deception, there's no debriefing. All the data was maintained to be anonymous. So anyone who was in the study didn't have to be identified, for example, by name. They could have been given a random number or random initials so that their privacy would be maintained. Okay, big 5 issues. The study does lack ecological validity because anything done in a lab environment does not reflect real-world conditions. Just to refresh your memory, ecological validity is the concept that a study or its findings can be applied to everyday life. So a study that was done in a naturalistic environment, a natural environment like a place that people are always socially gathering, somewhere that people like to go. For example, a cafe, a coffee shop, a movie theater, a library. If you were doing some kind of survey or a different kind of experiment, those have more ecological validity because they occurred in natural everyday circumstances and can very easily be applied to everyday life scenarios. A wonderful thing about the Baron-Cohen experiment is that it really addresses nature and nurture. Now, this is kind of the great debate in psychology. Are we made the way we are because we're born that way? Is it based on genetics and what makes us up on a biochemical level? Or is it based on nurture, how we're raised, how we grow up, who we spend our time with, the culture that we are so connected to when we're young? So we need to address both sides of that argument. The truth is that it's always both. Nature and nurture influence the individual in different ways, but they're both incredibly important. So we are going to discuss in class, as I've said, for an extra credit opportunity, nature and nurture. We've got an additional section here, and we will be completing this in class as a group. So in the soft text, when we are working together as a class, I'm going to have you record these 3 additional pieces of information. Now, this is going to be in addition to your outline. As you know, you'll have an outline that we do in class with the book for every single study. These are not going to be part of your outline. You're going to add them to your notebook, your class notebook. So we're going to be doing that in class together. And when I look over your notebooks, that will be a participation grade. So as long as you have gone ahead, found those concepts, explained them thoroughly, and put them in your notebook, I'll be checking those off for you for a nice, easy participation grade. And last, we have, of course, our homework PowerPoint questions. Same thing as before, guys. You're going to start with your written answer. These are all written answer questions. They're going to be on your upcoming quiz. To remind you, you have your AO number. Of course, you have the question number, and then in the brackets or the box, you have the point value of the question. So in this case, you're going to have 2 pointers and you're going to have 4 pointers. Now, the 2 pointers should be a few lines, I would say about 4 lines, four sentences, fully constructed sentences. And then if you have a 4-pointer, you should have like a small paragraph. So 2-pointer, about 4 lines, 4-pointer, a small paragraph. That's what you want to aim for. You want to make sure you answer these as detailed as you can. Just get straight to the point. Tell me the answer. Don't dance around it. Make sure you're being very clear in the way that you write because this AICE exam is scored in a very unique fashion. So just make sure you're being very, very pointed in your language and using scientific language that is as specific as possible about the study whenever you can. Please do your best not to speak in general terms. As per usual, these questions are going to be due a few days before your quiz. As always, we are going to collect them. I'll grade them for you, and then you'll get them back, and we'll go over each and every one before your quiz. So you will always have the right answers to study with, even if you got a question wrong. Our final slide is part of the appendix. Now remember, the appendix is at the very end. It is optional, it is not required, but it's got some additional information if you like this study, if you want to learn more about how it was conducted, if you're interested in autism or Asperger's and how they're being currently researched and treated, this is where you would want to look. So first I have for you, these are the list of mental states from the revised I-test. So this is words that you would find on the test. Some examples of the 4 answer choices that you would find on the Baron-Cohen revised I-test. So for example, if we take a look at this and we look at question 1, the 4 options that the person was given for question 1 are jealous, panicked, arrogant, and hateful. Option 2 was playful, comforting, irritated, and bored, and so on and so forth. It goes all the way down the line. And on our final slide, I've included for you the appendix. So we talked about, sorry, not the appendix, the glossary. So we have the glossary. We talked about how important the glossary was in getting rid of extraneous variables and really helping the participants to understand all the words, make sure they get the questions right or wrong based on their empathy abilities, their theory of mind abilities, and not based on a lack of vocabulary understanding. So this is the glossary that Baron-Cohen added to the revised test, and this is just a little piece of it for you. With that, guys, that is the end of our presentation. This is Miss Mokwa, again, Wellington High School, AICE Psychology program. If you have any questions or need any help, please write down whatever you need, bring it to me in class, come by during lunch. You can even shoot me an email if you need some help. So thank you so much for listening and have a wonderful day.